So I think this is a great and fascinating topic, and we have heard of generative AI and how it has developed in the last couple of days and weeks. And we are not all surprised, of course, but we see fascinated how fast, how quickly it is developing. And it is my pleasure to introduce and to welcome Stefan Boisman. Welcome to this conference and to the panel. We are delighted to have you. And this panel actually turned into a conversation because our second guest from Google couldn't make it to Marrakesh, unfortunately. So we have turned this panel into a conversation, and I would like to give Stefan 10 minutes to give some introductory remarks on the topic, and afterwards I would like to address 3 or 4 more questions and topics, and eventually we open up to you, to the audience, and you can ask your questions, and hopefully we can directly go into a deeper discussion. Stefan, so we have seen that AI is probably the topic of our times, and some expect AI to, well, overtake mankind and could be a threat to humanity. And, well, we all know the term from Kurzweil, how is it called? The singularity. And I think it was Henry Kissinger who recently said that this could be the end of the European Enlightenment, and maybe we have to restart a new enlightenment facing artificial intelligence. So we have a broad range of fascinating and pressing questions. And Stefan, thanks again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Henning. Thank you for the invitation also to be here. And as you mentioned, the AI is everywhere nowadays. The fear of the singularity is not something I would share quite as much as the people you're quoting, Elon Musk and so on, who are very fond of saying that AI is so fantastically good that very soon it will be as smart as we are. I don't think that we're quite there yet, but at the same time there are so many different applications where we can use artificial intelligence, the current versions that we have, finding patterns in large amounts of data to aid in decision making or in generating new content, as well, the generative AI craze is now about. In the financial sector, where I think we see a lot of this happening in anti-money laundering, transaction monitoring, credit risk assessments. For generative AI, a lot of it is currently focused on customer service rather than much more really financial applications, but I'm sure that soon we'll see more and more of this too. And of course, just for the economy generally speaking, as something that will be massively influential in how the job markets will be shaped the next 10, 20 years. With, as I'm sure you've seen, lots of predictions about massive job losses across the developed world in particular. That will be very interesting to see what actually unfolds there. And at the same time, I think aside from this massive potential that is being pointed at, the role that AI can play in supporting our decision making, in making tools more personalized, we of course also have this big challenge of trying to do this responsibly, as the title of the panel already points to. And for something like artificial intelligence, I think that's especially pressing because of the large scale that we see in the adoption of AI, the very, very many sectors that this will touch, from the government to the private sector, where virtually all companies will start to use AI in their business, core business, sooner or later. And of course for organizations like central banks, which will have to maybe not use AI themselves very actively, but get more and more of a regulatory role, also supervising the use of AI by financial institutions. So that puts us in for a very large challenge to somehow handle this new technology which moves very rapidly. We briefly talked about this in the green room, that the AI Act was outdated before it was even passed, and the EU had to scramble, as I think you were all aware of, to somehow include generative AI in the writing. So there's this challenge to handle these very fast developing technologies and do everything responsibly at the same time, because it's something we're adopting on a global scale. At the same time, even though that's very challenging, I'm really optimistic that this is something that we can do. Hence, I think also the historical lessons. We can design these technologies in a way that make them fit the values that we have in mind for them. Technologies, generally speaking, aren't completely neutral, so it's not just in how we use a technology once it's there, whether this is responsible or not. A lot goes into the initial stages of designing these technologies that then determines how we can use it and whether this is possible actually to use these technologies responsibly. For a low-tech example that I find illuminating in this case, back in the 1930s in the city of New York, one of the city planners built a series of bridges around a city park that he had just laid out. And these bridges were, it's not entirely clear if this was intentional, but in any case, they were just high enough for all the private cars to pass under, but they were too low for buses. So it was effectively impossible for the poorer population of New York City to reach the city park by public transportation. And it very effectively closed them out of the park. So the bridges were there, they were designed in a particular way to exclude parts of the population. And once it's been designed, once it's there, there's not much you can do about it anymore. The use doesn't make a difference. It's really in the design and in this initial phase of how are we setting up these technologies that the responsible part of these technologies comes in, and where we have to do the work. And you see the same kind of thing with artificial intelligence. It's in the design of these systems where we have a lot of control over what they will look like, whether they will have discriminatory results on populations, where, for example, recently in the US, we had insurance companies estimating healthcare risks based on the spending that people had on their treatment. And while this is something that intuitively may seem like a good proxy, a good estimate for whether you are having a serious disease or not, the result was that African American people in the United States got vastly lower risk scores because they went to less private hospitals, sometimes didn't get medical care at all because they weren't insured. And so for the exact same symptoms, they would get far lower risk scores than white people in the US. So you get these kind of discriminatory outcomes in the systems inbuilt by the choices that you make during the design. And similarly, there's going to be a lot of these kind of choices that you're making in the institutional setup for technologies. As a similar example from the US in the healthcare sector, they were struggling with the opioid epidemic there, and developed an AI system to determine the risk whether a particular patient was addicted to painkillers, to then advise doctors on whether to prescribe additional opioids, yes or no. And as a system by itself, this worked perfectly well. The problem was that the state legislation then started to require that doctors pay attention to the system, and went so far as to say that if doctors couldn't prove that they had looked at the AI system, then they could lose their professional license and they could be criminally prosecuted for not following the system. So the result is that lots of patients, when the system made a mistake, didn't get any kind of painkillers even though they needed them, because the doctors were too scared to go against the AI system. So it's both on this technical level where something like non-discrimination would come in, and on the more socio-technical, institutional level where we have to design things. And the good news is that we can do this kind of design. So that's where I want to end my opening statement. We can very actively take measures on both of these levels as designers, as clients requiring or putting forward the requirements on what these systems should look like to realize the values that we have in mind. So if you want to have a system that is fair, that doesn't discriminate, then there are a legion of technical solutions trying to ensure that, for example, let's say a credit risk assessment system will advise a bank to provide loans to two different populations at equal rates. Both of them will get loans 50% of the time that they ask for one, for example. And we can enforce this, and the systems will comply. The challenge is that there are a lot of different ways in which we can understand this kind of fairness. So you can understand it in terms of equal proportions, give them loans 50% of the time. You can understand it in terms of equal accuracy, so people who get loans should be able to afford them equally often. You can understand it in terms of individual basis. If people have similar incomes, similar financial situations, then they should be treated similarly. There are a lot of different specific technical options out there, and the policy challenge is going to be to determine, okay, which of these options do you as an organization deploying AI, requiring AI specifications, which of these understandings of fairness or of explainability do you want for the system? And how are you going to trade that off against all the other values that are important? So for banks, for example, if you make your loan assessment more fair, more equal across different groups, across different income distributions, then generally speaking, your profit margins will go down. And if you really enforce fairness on these algorithms, then you can see occasionally in simulations that profit margins can go down by as much as 30%. So making these systems non-discriminatory can be very expensive. And we have to trade off these choices. The nice thing is that we can explicitly do this now because we have the numbers to see, okay, how equal are we treating these groups? How much is this trading off against our accuracy of the system, against our profit margins? But it's a choice that we have to make explicitly. And that's going to be an important part of the conversation on how responsible AI gets fleshed out.
Stefan, thank you very much. And you are a philosopher by profession. And I mean, good and evil have always been forces and part of this world. And we have used fire as a weapon and at the same time as a useful tool. How would you describe artificial intelligence as a technology? So what are the differences compared to other technologies before? So how should or should we not really concerned about artificial intelligence? How would you describe specific characteristics and properties of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so it's definitely a tool, and I think as I try to explain, a lot of it goes into shaping this tool. But what's different about artificial intelligence compared to other technologies that we've had to deal with is, I think, first that it can handle much more complex cognitive tasks. So the kind of decisions that we're automating are different. The kind of tasks, let's say, take writing a policy report. It's not something that we would have thought of technology as doing for us, and now people are discussing this. I mean, it doesn't fully manage to write a policy report that we find acceptable, but the tasks are different. On the more technological level, the systems that we're using to automate these tasks are much more opaque. So if we compare it to the economic models that are being used currently to forecast macroeconomic forces, we understand how they work. We know what kind of assumptions are behind them. We can make a reasonable estimate of when they are trustworthy and when conditions have changed so much that the models become questionable, and we should find a different source to base our decisions on. We don't have any kind of sense of those underlying assumptions, of those boundaries of AI systems. They have them. They are very limited typically in how well they generalize. They can make lots of bad associations, spurious correlations. A funny example here is that Teslas, for quite a while, when it was full moon on the highway, they would pause and brake because they confused the full moon with an orange traffic light. So AI systems are very tending to do this kind of thing, to look at surface correlations and patterns that don't really go to the core of the issue, but you don't know which ones they're using because you don't actually have a good sense of what the complexities are underlying the system that it's using. And then things get complicated by the fact that they are applied at a very large scale and within very quick time frames typically. So that makes it more difficult, but the opacity is really what's new and what makes it so hard to ensure that these systems do what we want them to do.
Isn't it the property that artificial intelligence is able to learn exponentially? So there's a kind of a non-linearity in its development. Do you fear that we can probably miss the point of no return? We are no longer able to control artificial intelligence. I mean, that is something a lot of people fear, and we have seen that even Elon Musk has signed the letter to the open public that we should make a pause in developing artificial intelligence, and that is somehow ridiculous because at the same time he has launched another business dealing with artificial intelligence. But maybe behind this concern is something we should deal with, namely the possibility that we are not yet prepared to fully understand what could be a threat of artificial intelligence to mankind.
I partially agree with that. So what's behind a lot of these letters, and for example, Elon Musk and Sam Altman, when you see him from OpenAI, when you see him testify in Congress, is this image that artificial intelligence could become self-conscious or take over the world in one way or another. The singularity, as you refer to it.
Or at least a co-evolution,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. Start to behave like a person would behave. None of the systems that we currently have are remotely close to this, so everything that we can develop has very, very specific goals. For all of them, it's really optimizing a single variable, which we specify beforehand based on training data that we put in there. The result is that, yes, it can optimize for this particular variable really well if it's credit risk or, in the case of generative AI, predicting the next most likely word. It does that optimization really well, but it doesn't have any kind of thinking behind this, and it can't go beyond the parameters of the system. So those risks, not so much. The pause for let's assess what the current impacts on the world economy, on the world society are going to be and how we want to deal with those, yes. But that's a very different concern than what someone like Elon Musk is pressing on.
You have just mentioned that the European Commission has released an approach to regulate artificial intelligence, and the Commission has claimed that this is probably the first general and overall regulation of artificial intelligence. I'm not so sure, but it was kind of funny. You have mentioned that right after the Commission has launched or released the regulation, the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, there was the large language models and ChatGPT-4 and all those kind of stuff. And then the Commission said, well, we didn't expect that to happen. That was the funny thing of I think, the claim of the Commission to say this is the first general and robust regulation of artificial intelligence. So obviously it was not. How do you think an appropriate approach to regulate artificial intelligence should look like? I mean, what can be a robust regulation given that, well, artificial intelligence may leapfrogging, so we can expect some shifts in the abilities of artificial intelligence. How can we define a robust regulation in order to contain threats and to make possible all the potential, the economic and social potential of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, it's a very difficult challenge, of course. What all these different policy initiatives, so the EU, but UNESCO has a recommendation on this, the OECD is working on regulation, the United Nations just started up a high-level advisory body. So all of these initiatives, what they have in common is a value-based approach. So they try to identify a number of values: transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, safety, reliability, or robustness. A number of these high-level requirements in terms of this is what we as a society expect from, and then typically it's AI applications that have a high impact on citizens. This is also how the AI Act works, by looking at risk-based, what the risks will be for citizens affected by decisions made with these AI systems. And these, I think all these initiatives are wonderful, and it's very good that we have these lists of what we want out of these systems. The real challenge for regulators, but also for all the organizations that now have to start up self-compliance procedures for example, the AI Act, is that the regulation remains very vague as a result. So it tells you that systems should be transparent, but it doesn't tell you exactly what that entails. And we'll have to see in the courts, in practical implementation, what that's going to mean. It also makes it seem in something like the UNESCO recommendations that there is a very large international agreement on how we are going to shape responsible AI and what this is going to entail. But I think the devil is in the details here, and a lot of times it's very easy for countries in this particular case to sign up to these values and say, oh yes, we find all of these important, and then at the same time interpret them in very different ways, while still agreeing to the general regulatory format. So the challenge for the next couple of years and for, I think, all of the parties involved here is really to try to spell out, okay, what do those values mean in any level of detail?
And especially whose values, right? I mean, it's not just Europe that plays a role in developing and applicating artificial intelligence, but most importantly also China and the US. How do you assess this issue? So do we run into a systemic competition about artificial intelligence, or do we need something that was recently claimed as or suggested as a IPCC for artificial intelligence, so an international panel not for climate change, but to coordinate on a global level the ethics and the regulation of artificial intelligence in order to cope with the risks and to contain the risk and the threats? How would you assess that?
Yeah, well, I think even if we have a panel of this sort, then we are still going to have, because of fragmentation, which on this stage has been covered a lot already today, we're going to have this kind of competition between different power blocks in the world. And for something like AI, the difference in how we are trading off these values is going to be very important in how that plays out. So you see, for example, that China, which focuses less on privacy than the European Union does, has a much easier job of getting large quantities of data ready, which they need for high-quality artificial intelligence systems. A lot of this ultimately is really ensuring that you have access to good data. And so for them, it's much easier to get very well-functioning facial recognition systems, which are widely used in public spaces in China. Something which would be harder to get developed properly in Europe or the US. People do it, but a lot of the ways in which the original data sets were acquired are somewhat dubious, just by scraping Facebook and taking pictures without people's consent. So there is going to be a competition here anyway. Even if we agree on what we want out of these systems, then the trade-offs that we are willing to make, how much we value privacy, how much we value inclusivity, let's say, are still going to shape what kind of technologies we can develop. And then it maybe helps in this particular case of facial recognition, that something like that the European Union has decided not to do facial recognition in public spaces. So these are systems that we may not be able to develop as well as China, but we also don't want to develop them. We want to have different kinds of technologies. But this is going to be a challenge for a more sensitive sector, let's say the healthcare sector, or finance, where transaction monitoring across banks would be something that could very effectively help against money laundering, but creates large privacy risks by combining all of this transaction data from people in one place, where even if you do this anonymously, it's very easy to de-anonymize financial data again. So the privacy risks are going to be there. We can do more effective transaction monitoring if we combine all of this, but we have to make a political policy choice on which way we want to go.
Do you think artificial intelligence, for example, can help, for example, Africa to spur economic development, and what are the preconditions of doing so?
At the moment, it does bring some employment to Africa, but it's not the kind of employment that you would want. So OpenAI, for example, for ChatGPT, needed to have a filter in place to ensure that it doesn't provide sexist, racist comments, etc. And this was trained by having large numbers of people in Kenya go over the worst parts of the internet and say that this is not acceptable. And a lot of these people quit very quickly. They were paid $2 an hour, and they all left with psychological stress of one sort or another because of being exposed to all this terrible stuff from the internet. So this brings jobs to Africa, but they're not jobs that we should want. And a lot of this happens now because of this massive need for data, which to a large extent has to be provided by people. You see jobs like this, where people have to annotate data manually, move to countries where labor is cheap. So Africa, South Asia, these kinds of places. And yes, that brings some kind of jobs, but we need to be very careful in how this is done and under what kind of conditions this happens. And then presumably the productivity gains, yes, they will be there, but since we are concentrating these models in the hands of primarily the tech companies, it's going to be difficult to make sure that this really spreads evenly to the developing world.
Last question from my side before we open up to the audience. Artificial intelligence will not disappear from the world and from our daily lives. And it will not just be a matter of regulation and policy making. So how can we create, against this background, a culture of artificial intelligence? I mean, what are the educational, the philosophical, the ethical implications of artificial intelligence? We always have dealt with new technologies by creating a culture, and I think there's quite a fascinating interaction between the culture and the usage of technologies, vice versa. How do you think this can be applied to artificial intelligence? Is there, coming back to my first question, is there a crucial difference in creating and forming a culture, a societal approach to deal and to develop and to use efficiently and fairly artificial intelligence?
Yeah, there are a lot of educational training challenges in terms of how we are going to deal with this. To a large extent, we're lacking the human capital to fully benefit from these technologies. Also, both on the policy side to ensure that we really understand the technologies that we're trying to regulate and that we're trying to supervise, and on the technology side, where the focus is almost exclusively in educational computer science programs, on making sure that these systems are as accurate as possible. And as a result, very often, they focus so much on accuracy that they miss all the other constraints that are existing for these systems. So if you look at innovation of these kinds of technologies, a lot of it fails in the translation from having a system that's accurate to a system that's actually implemented and adds value to the value chain. In healthcare, for example, in general, about 2% of all the AI systems that are developed for hospitals gets actually used, and 98% fails because it doesn't fit the implementation practices that it has to work in. So there's a massive educational training gap there in ensuring that these computer scientists learn to anticipate what the demand is, and that we, as people who are going to use these technologies, can anticipate or talk to these designers and make clear what we want. And then once we have these systems, there's a challenge in training in how we are going to interact with them appropriately. Generative AI is a good example, and the business schools at Harvard and MIT recently did a nice study together with BCG to look at how generative AI is being used by their consultants. And they found that if they use it to do actual business problem solving, then their results are about 25% worse than if they don't use AI. So this is clearly a case of bad use. You start to over-rely on these systems. You trust it too much, and you get worse conclusions and worse thinking as a result. On the other hand, they saw massive productivity gains when they were just using it for brainstorming, to get initial ideas and to build and do the critical thinking on top of that without using generative AI. So there's going to be this challenge of, in professional training, how are we going to interact with these systems in a way where we rely on them when they're adding value and when we don't use them if they're not actually helpful.
Now it's your turn, and I would like to ask you to raise your finger or your arm, and once you are given the microphone, please state your name and, if possible, your affiliation. So I think in the back there's the first question, and then over there, please. I think it's on, isn't it?
Qatar Investment Authority. I have a question on EU regulation. Do you think that more stringent regulation on data privacy will put Europe at a disadvantage in terms of generative AI? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's difficult to say because I think this will really depend on the specific type of AI applications that we're looking at. Privacy regulation can definitely be a barrier to developing new AI systems. Data sharing is something that really helps to ensure that you have better AI systems. So the fact that GDPR puts in front of us a lot of barriers for this kind of data sharing makes it difficult. For generative AI, I haven't seen this as particularly an issue. So the current AI system that we have from OpenAI and Google, Meta, and so on, they are using so much data. This is really something in the trillions of words, vast amounts of data, that the GDPR is not a particular obstacle to that. They are having to deal now with the fact that a lot of this data was in fact stolen. So they pirated a lot of books from authors, and they took practically the entire internet, the New York Times archives, etc., without permission. So they have a lot of intellectual property rights issues with the data that they gathered, but not necessarily privacy ones. So it doesn't have to be a barrier in those settings, and I don't think making privacy regulations less stringent will make for better generative AI anytime soon, because the data isn't the issue there anymore. And in a lot of other situations, you don't need very, very large amounts of data in order to get helpful, functional AI systems. Even with all the privacy regulations in place, we are capable right now of developing anomaly detection systems for banks that work much better than current systems do. We can have diagnostic systems for lung cancer that are much more accurate than human doctors. There are a lot of these situations where AI can function very well as long as you have high quality data rather than large amounts of data. And I think to underline the importance that it's high quality, there were, during COVID, a lot of attempts to design AI systems that could analyze whether a COVID infection was serious or not, to quickly help to facilitate decision-making by doctors on what kind of treatment to offer, whether to send someone to the ICU, etc. And data sharing was much easier because it was a pandemic, etc. Data wasn't the issue. 400 of these top-notch research groups tried to develop these systems, and none of them worked. All of these projects failed, and the reason fundamentally was that, well, one system, for example, had taken all the COVID patients were photographed lying down, and the healthier patients were photographed standing up. So the system would learn whether you were lying down or whether you were standing up. Another system had taken COVID patients who were adults, primarily older adults, so people in their 60s, and then healthier patients were in their 20s. So the system would learn how old you are. A third system would have COVID patients from Italy and healthy patients from the Netherlands, and then it would learn your nationality. So the kind of data that you manage to get and the quality of the signal that's in there, whether it really helps you predict what you want to predict, that's much more crucial than the quantity itself.
Thank you very much. The next one is over there, please. And then we have, there was the next one, and then over there.
Hi, I'm Aaron Captain, UBS Investment Bank. I have two questions. So one is sort of a timeline question. You've given some examples of the difficulty of implementation, sort of a demand constraint, or lack of understanding, lack of good quality data. But I think a lot of my clients would be surprised. They think it's now, and I get the type of questions of, are we going to see it in the productivity data next quarter, next year? Could you talk maybe a little bit about the supply constraints? Like, are there enough programmers to sort of? So part of it's the usage, but do we have enough people who can actually program AI and are knowledgeable about the software and can be embedded into firms? And curious about that. And then the second question is, computers famously never showed up in the productivity data, and there was no supplier demand constraint on computers. And so, one question I have is, you mentioned AI is good at cognitive tasks. Is it also something that can start to improve automation, the manufacturing process? I mean, the way we produce cars hasn't really changed very much since 1980, but because those are things that definitely would show up in the productivity data. So could it help on those type of things as well?
Yeah, thanks. On the supply side, I think we have a similar challenge. So there are a lot of programmers who can develop these kinds of systems, and the bar to programming functioning AI systems becomes much lower and lower every year. So it is now much, much easier and requires far less training to develop a helpful, accurate AI system based on internal data than it was 5 years ago. That has really helped the supply side of things. The challenge still then is to ensure that the systems that are being developed meet what the actual added value for a particular application would be. And very often what I see is that programmers focus solely on this accuracy metric that they've been trained is the holy grail and should be as high as possible. and ignore what actually is the business problem and the business value of the potential system. So you get a lot of systems and it's very easy to develop them, but it's very hard for these developers to then make it integrated into the business. So as a result, my expectation would be, also in this sense, yes, we can have thousands of AI systems developed tomorrow. You won't see them show up in the quarterly reportings anytime soon, because the actual challenge is developing AI systems that add value, and that's much harder. And we don't have a lot of people who are good at that part. For the productivity then, the AI systems currently are very much focused on these cognitive tasks. So robotics in car manufacturers is something that people are working on, but automating, especially the fine motor skills that people have, is very difficult. And the machine learning systems that we hear about are not, most of the versions that you hear in the news aren't tailored for that kind of task. Maybe we'll see them, but that's further away than the generative AI decision-making type systems.
Thanks. Next one, please.
Yes, now? Yeah, okay. And my name is Charles Kalshoven, APG Asset Management. So I have a question on the implications for growth. So what we see is trade is slowing, but if you look at services, that's growing a lot. That's also an opportunity for a lot of emerging markets. But is AI competing with this kind of trade? So I'm thinking of India, for example. Is this better? Okay. Yes. Yeah. I think I was almost. Did you hear the first part? Okay. So I'm thinking of India, where of course there's a lot of services that they export. So basically, my question is AI complementary to human workers there, or is it a substitute? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. For example, one of the large services in India is programming, and programming is exactly one of these areas where you do see generative AI having an edge in terms of it being able to do a lot of the simple programming tasks that people would normally routinely do and would get, I think, outsourced to places like India. The more complicated programming tasks, where you really have to create a system that's new and different, are harder to get out of these generative AI systems. But the routine stuff does get replaced to some extent. And I think similarly with things like customer service, I would expect, at least just from a cost perspective, that generative AI would pick up a part of those jobs. Because you can make things more efficient, you can have chatbots that actually help you to some extent, etc. So there are going to be implications there, absolutely. At the same time, it could also help with the relevant education, training, etc., to increase their productivity on the programming side, as an example. So if they can state what the problem is supposed to be, which is often a very large part of what a programmer has to do, figure out what the problem actually is that you need a piece of code for, what is it supposed to do. If that's something that they are capable of learning, and then interact with a system that writes the actual code for you, then you have a more interesting, higher value type of job. But that's really a transition that requires additional training, that makes it more of a in-between job than executing the exact commands that someone gives you, sort of write me a piece of code that does this. So I think there is going to be competition to some extent, at least. Not for a lot of the systems in, let's say, the financial markets, looking at transaction monitoring or know your customer procedures. That's not something we were outsourcing to these places anyway. But it's something that would have impact for the large compliance operations in banks. But some of this will get replaced. The question, I think, to a large extent, is how fast, and then a lot of the projections that we're currently seeing keep getting adjusted downwards. IBM initially, when they started to use generative AI, said, oh, we're going to lose lots of jobs, and now they announced a new hiring spree, because suddenly they realized that they needed more people because they could do more now. That's not going to be the case everywhere, but the job loss statistics or predictions are probably exaggerated from the hype of, oh, we have AI systems that can do something now. But there are going to be job losses, I would expect.
Thank you. I think the next question was over there. Please.
You can hear me now, yes. I'm Robert Blome. I'm a policy consultant. And I have a comment on something you said, plus two other comments on generative AI I'd like your opinion on. In the case of China, I think, as you mentioned, China's ability, or almost unrestrained ability to develop databases and complete databases, by the same token, creates a barrier to access to that data from outside of China. So it makes the data even more a kind of national security asset. So I wanted to bring up that point. For all that capability, it also makes it more perhaps difficult of access from outside. It's okay for Chinese. For generative AI, of course there's a fear that people won't write anymore. You know, there won't be writing. It won't be necessary writing. I think it's an issue of glass half empty or glass half full. I think what generative AI is going to do is it's going to change writing into editing. We're not going to be copywriters anymore. We're going to be editors to improve the first draft that AI is going to give us. And the reason I say that is that generative AI is an offshoot of machine translation. We know that. And machine translation is very, very good now, particularly Google Translate, which is a learning type software. And that's exactly, machine translation takes the burden off translators. You don't have to write the draft, you just correct it. And so I think that's the great thing that generative AI does. It'll improve the quality of written materials because you take the first draft, you look at it, and you improve on it. You find the mistakes, and then usually, and this is my third point, generative AI has a tendency to reproduce the conventional. It's all conventional. It's what's said by the most people. It's surveying and collecting the vast universe. And so you lose the unconventional or the original in that whole mass. So generative AI is always going to give you the very obvious stuff and so on, which by that same token is not very interesting. And it's for you, the writer, to go and find out what's missing from this and so on. And my third point is this issue of conventionality versus originality. AI is never really going to promote the unconventional. Unconventional is driven by human passion. You have a hypothesis or an idea. Nobody agrees with it. Nobody's written about it. Generative AI is not going to find it in the vast pool, but you push it. You really believe in this, and it's your passion that's pushing that. And I think that force is very hard to incorporate in a generative AI context where, you know, a machine is going to take this single human interest in pushing it, you know, almost an obsession in pushing a single unconventional idea. Anyway, those are my three comments, and I'd like your comment on that.
So knowledge as an epistemic statistics, probably.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. I agree on China also, because for privacy reasons, it's then going to be very difficult for outside firms to use this data, even if China were to give us access. On generative AI, yes and no. I think it's really important in these cases that writers have their message thought out beforehand. What you see is that if you have a first draft, that you just say, oh, write me a a first speech for the festival, or you become less critical once you have the first draft without having thought through the points yourself. So it really depends on the role that you give it in the process. And then, yes, it can help. At the same time, sometimes you don't need these long texts. So I was talking to one of the government agencies in the Netherlands recently, and they had planned to let citizens write a short text of what they wanted from the agency. ChatGPT would then turn it into a more formal report. And then the next thing that would happen is that ChatGPT would summarize the formal report into a short summary for the civil servant that was actually supposed to handle the case. Complete nonsense to use generative AI twice in the same decision procedure to first make it into a long formal thing and then summarize. So sometimes this can also help us point to institutional inefficiencies that we can do away with, not by introducing technology to do things automatically for us, but by simplifying the institutional procedure and doing institutional innovations there.
There's one last question, I'm afraid, from you, please.
It's working.
I think it's on.
So first, thank you for this insightful presentation. I'm Abdelaziz Eitali, economist at the Policy Center for the New South. So I'm just wondering, I think you answered to this question, but just wondering what would be the implication of this new technology but on different fronts. Because the economist Amai tells me that from a macro perspective, this is a very timely technology because we're living through an era of secular stagnation. Productivity gains have been slowing for a while, so we need to push even further the technological frontier. And AI is actually the right tool that will allow us to move one step further and to move to another plateau of growth. And this has been mentioned by other people from the audience. But at the same time, the father Amai is a bit worried about the future of his kids, how the educational system in such a country, a developing country, should adapt even to today's jobs. But tomorrow's jobs, we're not even at that stage to imagine what would be the implication, how should the system, which is quite fixed and rigid, to adapt and to deliver in terms of the right skills to our kids. And the citizen Amai, which is a bit naive and confused, is just happy about using this kind of tools to generate images, ChatGPT, to answers to my questions. So in a broad sense, there would be some distributional effects, I imagine, across the globe, between countries, within countries, and this will yield inevitably some inequality, which is something that everyone is suffering from. And in the long term, I believe that the economic system in general should be inclusive in order to be sustainable, because once not everyone is in the train, not everyone is reaping the benefits of such a technology at a certain time, there are going to be some fractures that would not at the end serve anyone from the globe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree, there are really big educational challenges in front of us now. On the one hand, I would say this is partly up to the designers of these systems who have to find good ways for us to interact with them, not to require massive new skills in the population. If a company has to integrate AI into their business process, then this has to be done in a way that we don't need to teach everyone about the technical details about AI in the first place. There has to be a natural way of working together with these systems and of being able to get an intuitive sense of when they are reliable and when they are completely bonkers and off their head. We have some sense of this. So, for example, when COVID hit, supply chains partly broke down because all the AI systems they had used to optimize these systems could no longer cope with the different types of demands. They weren't tuned to people ordering large amounts of toilet paper and soap. And so they just completely mispredicted, made massive mistakes in the prediction of what the sales would be. And supply chains had to be adjusted. These systems had to be completely rewritten to conform to the new reality of what the supply chains looked like. So some of this is there. We have some sense of where these boundaries lie, but only in really extreme cases. And it's up to the designers of these systems, I think, to a large extent, to make sure that this becomes more accessible to the people who actually have to work with them in a business context. And then, of course, I agree there's the challenge of preparing the next generation for these systems and working together with them. And I think that really has to be in this intersection between the technologies and what we want from them.
Thank you very much. I have, maybe as a conclusion, I have given a sign that we need to finish. Maybe one more minute as a conclusion. I find it interesting that our first response to AI is to ask, well, what are the threats and opportunities? And the second immediate response is, what is our role related to artificial intelligence? How optimistic are you that we are able to redefine ourselves in a creative and responsible way towards artificial intelligence?
To keep it short, I think we absolutely can. It just requires active work.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and to the audience. Thank you very much for attending, listening, and contributing to this interesting discussion. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. We have now concluded our sessions for the day. Enjoy.
I